Welcome back to The Deep Dive. Today, we're looking at something pretty extraordinary that happened back on September 30th, 2025, at Marine Corps Base Quantico.
Yeah, it really was. If you ever wanted to see how an institution's culture could be, well, jolted in basically a single afternoon, this is it.
Exactly. We're talking about this totally unprecedented summit. You had almost 800 of the U.S.'s top military leaders, generals, admirals, senior enlisted folks, all suddenly called back from posts around the globe.
Pulled in from everywhere. And the striking thing was there was almost no public agenda given beforehand. So naturally, speculation was just, running wild.
That's the core of it, isn't it? A really high-stakes meeting, huge logistical undertaking, featuring President Trump and the Defense Secretary at the time, Pete Hegseth. And our sources, they show that the speeches given weren't really about foreign threats, not primarily anyway. They were laser-focused on what the administration saw as internal battles, culture wars, ideological fights within the military itself.
Precisely. So for you listening, our mission today is really to unpack the sources on this. We want to understand the kind of dual message that came out of Quantico.
Okay.
First, there was this clear declaration and end to what they call politically correct leadership. And tied to that, a whole new set of internal standards being laid out.
Right. And the second part?
The second part was this proposal for a drastically different role for the military. Much more muscular, as some sources put it, and specifically focused domestically, inside the U.S.
Okay, let's really dig into this then. What were the specific orders, the directives they handed down? And importantly, what was the reaction, from all those senior officers flown in from all over?
Yeah, the reaction is key. Because this deep dive, it really shows us this wasn't just like a minor policy shift. This was a very deliberate, almost ideological push to redefine the military. Its identity, its culture, its mission. And they started right at the top, very publicly. #TagNetTSI. The unusual context and pre-meeting tension.
So let's start with just the sheer scale of this thing. And frankly, the risk involved. Our sources really hammer this point, ordering nearly 800 top commanders to one spot like that. It's just not done.
It really isn't. I mean, think about it. These are generals, admirals, they're senior enlisted leaders, suddenly told to drop everything and fly back to Virginia.
From operational commands, some of them.
Absolutely. From posts all around the world, including active areas, senior commanders, they meet, but usually it's virtual or maybe regional groups. A gathering this size, this suddenness, it's exceptionally rare.
And it immediately sparked concern, right? People wondering if some massive global crisis was about to break.
Exactly. That was the initial speculation. What emergency could possibly require this? But then the focus wasn't external at all.
It pivoted entirely inward to, as critics pointed out, the domestic culture wars.
Right. And that raised other flags. Beyond just the, huge cost of flying everyone in, critics immediately pointed to the strategic danger.
Concentrating all that leadership.
Precisely. One former defense official we looked at called it an inexcusable strategic risk. To have that many leaders, key figures in the operational chain of command, all together in one publicly known place at a specific time.
It sounds like a massive vulnerability.
It does. I mean, the whole point of distributed command is security, right? So critics argued that choosing to do this for this kind of meeting showed a really strange set of priorities, like ideology was trumping basic operational security.
And the man driving this, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, he wasn't exactly controversy-free leading up to this, was he?
No, not at all. His tenure, even before Quantico, was already marked by some pretty aggressive moves and, frankly, some serious questions about security.
Like what, specifically?
Well, the sources detail a couple of really concerning incidents. There was one potential breach where he apparently accidentally added a journalist to an encrypted signal chat.
A chat discussing classified war plans.
That's what the sources indicate, yes. Classified war plans. And then separately, reports that he shared details about ongoing military operations with his family and his personal lawyer through another channel.
Wow. Okay, sharing classified info, even accidentally, with a journalist? That's incredibly serious. That alone must have created a huge amount of unease among the professional military ranks.
You'd have to assume so.
Yeah.
It certainly set a tense backdrop. And it wasn't just the security stuff. Hegseth had already been making big changes to the senior leadership, purging ranks, essentially.
What kind of changes?
He ordered significant cuts, a 10% cut to the number of general officers overall, which is substantial, but even more targeted, a 20% cut for the 4-star officers, the very top tier.
20%, that's huge.
It is. And he'd also fired several really high-profile figures, people like General C.Q. Brown, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Milley, General McKenzie, General Chiarelli, names that represent the established military leadership.
So these weren't just random cuts. Firing those specific individuals, people who led through the post-9/11 era, often had, let's say, complex relationships with the previous Trump administration. That sends a message.
A very clear message. It signaled a top-down effort to dismantle the existing hierarchy. The idea seemed to be replacing them with leaders perceived as more aligned, ideologically, with the administration's new direction.
So everyone sitting in that room at Quantico knew the score. They knew their jobs could be on the line based on perceived loyalty.
Absolutely. That context is crucial. And then you had President Trump's comments just before the meeting, which seemed deliberately contradictory.
How so?
Well, first he kind of downplayed it, said it was really just a very nice meeting, talking about military success, focusing on esprit de corps, positive reinforcement.
Which is a bit of a morale booster.
But then, almost in the same breath, he issued this very public threat. Right before getting on Marine One, he told reporters, basically, if he didn't like someone at the meeting,
I'm going to fire them right on the spot. Yeah, I remember that quote.
Exactly. So it's this mix of everything's great and cross me and you're gone. It perfectly captured the underlying tension of the whole event.
It defined the atmosphere. Nice chat, but immediate termination for dissent.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And that led to the skepticism we talked about. Critics looked at the context, the cost, the risk, the rhetoric, and concluded it wasn't about urgent military matters.
Which brings us back to that quote from Senator Gallego, the Iraq vet.
Right. He just said it plainly. This meeting could have been an email.
Yeah.
That really summed up the feeling that this was political theater, not operational necessity.
And anonymous defense officials echoed that, right? Calling it a total waste of money, flying nearly 800 commanders around the globe, pulling them off duty. Just a misuse of time and resources.
Yeah, the criticism on the cost and the strategic risk was pretty sharp.
Okay, so the stage is set. Tense atmosphere, high stakes. Then Secretary Hegseth steps up. And he delivers this core message, right? Basically declaring the end of an era in military leadership.
He did. And the language was incredibly direct, even aggressive. His main line was, the era of politically correct, overly sensitive, don't hurt anyone's feelings leadership ends right now at every level.
That's a pretty blunt rejection of a lot of the emphasis we've seen in recent decades on things like inclusivity, harassment prevention.
It was an explicit instruction to reverse course on that. He framed the military as having lost its way. There's that quote, we lost our way and we became the woke department, but not anymore. We're done with that shit.
Using that kind of language, shit, in a formal address to generals and admirals, it's clearly meant to signal a radical break.
Absolutely. He was declaring war on the prevailing culture of the institution he was leading. And he named specific targets for this purge.
What were they?
He called them social justice, politically correct, and toxic ideological garbage, and listed things like diversity, equity, and inclusion offices, the DEI programs, identity months celebrating different groups. He mentioned dudes in dresses, which is obviously a dismissive term for transgender service members, and even climate change worship.
Interesting, he lumps climate science in there with DEI and gender identity.
Well, that's part of the strategy, isn't it? Frame them all as equally invalid, equally non-military distractions. Things to be purged to restore focus. It functions like an ideological purity test, disguised as a readiness measure.
Okay, so first the ideological purge, then the doctrine shifts, right? It moves from ideas to the physical body, fitness standards.
Yes, and this got very personal very quickly. Hegseth focused heavily on physical appearance and condition. And he didn't mince words. He used lines apparently designed to provoke, like, fat troops are tiring to look at.
Wow, wow, that's not just setting a standard, that's active shaming.
It is. And he didn't limit it to junior troops. He aimed it right at the senior leaders in the room. He said, it's completely unacceptable to see fat generals and admirals in the halls of the Pentagon. It's a bad look.
Okay, hold on. Fitness standards for generals and admirals, they're usually different, right? I mean, these are often older officers, policy roles, desk jobs. Not necessarily infantry. What's the signal there?
The signal seemed to be that fitness was now part of this ideological alignment. It wasn't just about being able to perform physically. It was about looking the part, projecting a certain image.
So what was the new requirement?
Commanders were ordered to crack down, mandatory weigh-ins and fitness tests twice a year, specifically for officers. That level of scrutiny on senior ranks is really unusual. It reinforces this idea that cultural buy-in, looking the part, was becoming as important as anything else.
And he had that golden rule analogy too, right?
Yes, that was a key rhetorical device. He basically asked the commanders to think about their own children serving. Would they want their kids serving with fat or unfit or undertrained troops, or in units where standards were lowered so certain types of troops could make it in?
Framing it as protecting their own kids.
Exactly. He demanded the answer be hell no. It uses that parental instinct to justify very rigid, aggressively enforced standards, and it paints any flexibility as basically a moral failure endangering young service members.
So once he had established fitness as this sort of ideological marker, how did he apply it to the whole issue of women in combat roles? That's been a huge point of discussion for years.
He announced a major reversal. He stated that the military would ensure every designated combat arms position returns to the highest male standard only. Or, as he also put it, male-level standards.
Highest male standard only. That's unambiguous. What did he say about the implications for women?
He was very blunt about it. If women can make it, excellent. If not, it is what it is. He explicitly said, if that means no women qualify for some combat jobs, so be it.
And the justification?
The justification was purely about standards for combat effectiveness. He argued, this is combat, this is life or death, and suggested that any perceived lowering of standards for inclusivity inherently weakened the force.
This must have sparked immediate debate. How did the sources capture that?
Oh yeah, instant division. On one side, you had figures like Senator Joni Ernst, Republican, an Iraq veteran herself who called the idea appropriate. She argued for maintaining single, high standards in combat roles.
Okay. And the opposition?
Strong pushback. Janessa Golbeck, CEO of the Vet Voice Foundation, called it He-Man culture war theatrics and accused Hegseth of just stoking grievance. She basically painted it as performative toughness, not a serious readiness policy. Said he had a cartoonish 1980s comic book idea of toughness.
So, deep ideological splits there. Did the doctrine extend to other aspects of appearance, like grooming?
It did. Hegseth really doubled down on traditional military appearance standards. The mandate was clear. No more beards, long hair, superficial individual expression. Simple instructions. Cut our hair, shave our beards, and adhere to standards.
Beards have been a point of discussion recently, with some exceptions allowed. How did he address that?
He used that interestingly informal, almost mocking language again. He called men who refused to shave beardos.
Beardos in a formal address.
Yep, and advised these beardos to find a new position or a new profession, unless they were in special forces where beards are sometimes okay for operational reasons.
Using a term like beardos, it's not just regulation, it's like he's actively ridiculing the previous, slightly more relaxed approach.
That seemed to be the intent. Underscore the shift, make the old ways seem unprofessional, almost silly. He declared, the era of unprofessional appearance is over, but the language felt very personal, very dismissive.
And the final piece of his doctrine focused on leadership itself, redefining terms like toxic leadership.
Correct. This was a really significant move. He announced a full review of how terms like toxic leadership, bullying, and hazing are defined and applied. His claim was that these words had been weaponized and bastardized to undermine commanders and NCOs.
So the argument is that holding leaders accountable for harsh methods has gone too far, making them afraid to lead effectively.
That's the argument he put forward. The stated goal was to empower leaders to enforce standards without fear of retribution or second-guessing. He wanted to make sure that, forgivable, earnest, or minor infractions didn't ruin careers.
Basically recalibrating accountability downwards.
In effect, yes. He explicitly said that leading warriors to high standards isn't toxic, and if that view made him toxic, then so be it. He was deliberately sanctioning a more aggressive, top-down leadership style, signaling that complaints about it might not be received sympathetically anymore.
And he finished with that ultimatum for the audience, right?
A really stark one. He told the assembled generals and admirals straight up that if his message was making your heart sink, then they should do the honorable thing and resign.
Wow. So get on board completely or get out.
That was the clear message. Total ideological conformity was now required for continued service at the highest levels.
Okay, so after Hegseth lays down this intense internal doctrine, President Trump takes the stage. And the focus seems to broaden, right?
Yeah.
Moving from internal culture to redefining the military's fundamental role, starting with its name.
Yeah, that was a big symbolic gesture. He immediately praised the idea of renaming the Department of Defense back to its original name, the Department of War.
His quote was something like, "I love the name, I think it stops wars."
Exactly. Tapping into that historical resonance. It was the Department of War from 1789 until 1949, after the National Security Act created the unified DoD structure.
But our sources stress something important here, the legal reality of that change.
Critically important. Trump signed an executive order directing the name change. But an executive order can't just override federal law like that. Changing the name officially requires an act of Congress.
So it was more of a statement of intent, a rhetorical move, than an immediate legal change.
Precisely. Though Hegseth strongly supported it. He made this pretty extraordinary claim that the U.S. hasn't won a major theater war since the name change from war to defense in 1947.
Wait, seriously. He blamed the name change for outcomes in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq.
That was the implication. Like a huge historical claim, obviously debatable, but the point was to frame defense as inherently passive or weak.
And war as projecting strength, readiness to win.
Right. Justifying the need for the more aggressive name, even if Congress hadn't acted yet.
And that theme of aggression, of winning, tied directly into Trump's most norm-shattering proposals, didn't it? The ones about the military's role inside the U.S.
Yes. The sources describe him outlining a muscular and at times norm-shattering view of the military's role in domestic affairs.
How did he justify that shift?
He used this very specific, very charged language about an internal threat, an invasion within. He said, quote, "We're under invasion from within, no different than a foreign enemy, but more difficult, because they don't wear uniforms."
That framing is key, isn't it? Equating domestic problems, crime, unrest, whatever he meant, with a foreign invasion. Because that opens the door, rhetorically at least, to using military force domestically.
It absolutely does, and that led right into his most startling proposal, using American cities as training grounds.
Can you elaborate on that? What exactly did he propose?
He said, we should use some of these dangerous cities as training grounds for our military National Guard, but our military. And then he specifically added, because we're going into Chicago very soon.
Using U.S. cities for urban warfare training with active military personnel. I mean, the Pars Comitatus Act generally prohibits that, right?
Generally, yes. There are exceptions. But this kind of proposal flies in the face of long-standing American tradition and law separating military operations from domestic law enforcement. It immediately drew fire. Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois called it a dangerous assault on our democracy.
Treating citizens like enemy combatants in their own cities.
That was the fear. But this wasn't entirely out of the blue. It built on some earlier moves, didn't it?
Right. There was that executive order from August directing the military to train a specific quick reaction force.
Exactly. A force designed to quell civil disturbances. Trump had explicitly linked this force to dealing with the enemy within, blurring those lines between policing and military action even further.
And connected to potentially deploying troops domestically, he announced a change in how they should deal with protesters, a shift in the rules of engagement.
A significant and potentially dangerous shift. He talked about seeing soldiers being yelled at by protesters and feeling they should be able to retaliate physically.
And he asked the generals and admirals directly.
He did. He said, if it's okay with you, generals and admirals, I've taken that off. I say, they spit, we hit. Is that okay?
They spit, we hit. That's basically sanctioning immediate physical retaliation for non-lethal provocation. It seems like it throws proportionality right out the window.
It does. It potentially removes crucial layers of de-escalation training and restraint. It tells soldiers that the commander-in-chief expects them to respond physically to insults or minor physical acts like spitting.
Which creates huge legal and ethical problems for soldiers on the ground, surely.
Immense uncertainty. Right. They're being told, essentially, that standard rules of engagement regarding proportional force are suspended in favor of direct physical reprisal.
Okay, so major shifts in domestic role and rules of engagement. Did he talk about funding this new vision?
Yes, he made some big promises on that front. Pledged a massive $1 trillion to the military budget in 2026. That's up significantly from the $895 billion approved for 2025.
$1 trillion. That's the financial muscle behind the muscular vision.
It would seem so. He also mentioned specific plans for naval expansion. 19 new ships, including submarines, destroyers, assault ships.
And then there was that odd comment about ship aesthetics.
Right. Amidst all this high-level strategy and funding, he paused to mention he didn't like the look of some modern ships. Added, an ugly ship is not necessary.
It's just such a strange detail to include in that setting, emphasizing appearance again, even for warships.
It is. It sort of reinforces that theme we saw earlier, projection, image, appearance mattering deeply alongside the substance. Hashtag tag HRV, audience reaction, and critical response.
So, you have this room full of nearly 800 career military leaders. They've just been subjected to Hegseth's intense ideological purge doctrine, the fat-shaming, the threats. Then Trump outlines this radical domestic vision and new rules of engagement. How did they react? What did the sources say about the mood in the room?
The sources are really consistent on this. They describe the audience as sitting mostly stone-faced and silent throughout the speeches.
Stone-faced, not applauding, not reacting visibly.
Mostly not. They were, by all accounts, adhering very strictly to the military's tradition of nonpartisanship, remaining neutral, showing no political favor, which apparently was quite a contrast to the kind of reception President Trump often expected or received at his political rallies.
That silence must have been quite something, especially when he directly addressed them about disagreeing.
Yeah, that moment sounds incredibly tense. Trump apparently encouraged applause at one point, but then immediately followed with that threat. If you don't like what I'm saying, you can leave the room. But there goes your rank and there goes your future.
And the reaction to that?
Just nervous laughter, according to the reports. Not enthusiastic agreement, not defiance, just nervousness. It paints a picture of an audience feeling pressured, maybe intimidated, rather than inspired. Compliance under duress.
We already mentioned Senator Gallego saying it could have been an email, but other critics, especially anonymous defense officials, had harsher words about the meeting itself, right? Focusing on the logistics and timing.
They did. The criticism about the strategic risk of gathering everyone was severe. Multiple former and current officials apparently condemned it as just irresponsible.
Why irresponsible? Beyond the vulnerability aspect.
Because it pulled key commanders away from their actual jobs, potentially during sensitive times globally, for what they saw as basically a political lecture. The cost, the disruption, the risk, all for a meeting focused on domestic culture wars and ideology. It seemed, to these critics, like a profound misallocation of resources and attention. That inexcusable strategic risk, quote, really captures it.
And there was formal political condemnation, too, from Capitol Hill.
Yes. Senator Jack Reed, the top Democrat on the Armed Services Committee at the time, didn't hold back. He called the whole event an expensive, dangerous dereliction of leadership.
Strong words. Did he comment on Hegseth's ultimatum, the resign if you don't like it part?
He specifically called that ultimatum profoundly dangerous. His argument was that demanding ideological conformity like that fundamentally undermines the professional, nonpartisan nature required for the military to function effectively in a democracy.
It's also reported that some of Hegseth's comments, particularly about military history, didn't land well with the officers in the room.
Right. That claim about the U.S. not winning a major war since 1947, that apparently caused real offense.
How so?
Well, think about it. Many of the officers sitting right there had spent their entire careers, made their bones, as one source put it, fighting in conflicts like Afghanistan and Iraq. They led troops, lost comrades, and here they were being told by the Secretary of Defense that their service was part of a 75-year legacy of failure, essentially.
While also being lectured about their fitness and supposed lack of warrior ethos.
Exactly. Critics, especially veterans commenting afterwards, called it an insane insult to the very people he was supposed to be leading. It created this bizarre dynamic lecturing experienced combat leaders about toughness while simultaneously dismissing their actual combat experience.
So summing up the reaction, stone faces, nervous laughter followed by sharp criticism about cost, risk, political interference, and even direct insults to the assembled leadership.
Pretty much. The dominant view among critics seemed to be that this massive, expensive, risky gathering wasn't about national security strategy. It was political theater, He-Man culture war theatrics, as Goldbeck put it, designed to enforce ideological alignment above all else.
Prioritizing the internal purity campaign over operational readiness and global realities.
That's certainly how many sources interpreted it. A spectacle confirming the administration was forcing a cultural revolution, demanding absolute conformity to its specific vision of what a warrior must be, think, and look like. Hashtag tag outro.
So when we pull back and look at this whole Quantico summit, this deep dive really highlights a fundamental tension, doesn't it?
It really does. You have this immense logistical effort, huge cost, significant strategic risk, pulling top commanders from duties worldwide.
All for what turns out to be essentially an ideological lecture, focused almost entirely inward. purging woke ideas, dictating very specific standards for fitness and appearance, redefining leadership, and then proposing this really controversial new domestic mission for the military.
And what's so striking, I think, is how clearly this event marked the embedding of the nation's broader culture wars directly into the heart of the Pentagon.
Yeah.
It wasn't just policy anymore.
No, it felt like an attempt at a complete cultural overhaul, right?
Yeah.
Trying to reshape the identity, the very definition of what it means to be a service member in the U.S. military, and demanding ideological buy-in along with the usual military discipline.
Exactly. So for you listening, what's the big takeaway here? Well, the sources keep coming back to that strategic risk element.
The fact that they concentrated the entire senior operational command in one known place at one time for what many saw as basically an internal pep rally, or less charitably, an ideological purge session.
Right. And that raises a really critical question for you to think about. What does it signal about national security priorities when the perceived need for internal ideological alignment seems to take precedence over long-established operational security protocols?
When tidying up the internal house, culturally speaking, becomes more urgent than guarding against external threats or even just basic security procedures for leadership.
Precisely. That apparent inversion of priorities, internal ideology over operational security and global focus might be the single most defining and perhaps troubling aspect of that whole Quantico summit, something to really mull over.
Indeed. A lot to consider there. We hope this deep dive helped you unpack the significance of those events at Quantico. Thanks for joining us.
We'll see you next time.